On a bitterly cold winter night, when the snow fell in heavy, suffocating silence, I first heard it, a low, mournful wail carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the storm playing tricks on my ears. But as I trudged through the snow toward my cabin, the sound grew louder, clearer, and more human. When I reached the front door, I saw them. Footprints in the snow. Bare, human footprints. They started at the edge of the forest and stopped abruptly at my porch. Like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. That was the night I learned the cold doesn't just kill, it hunts. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. A week alone in my grandfather's old mountain cabin, surrounded by nothing but snow, silence, and the whisper of pine trees swaying in the wind. After a year of chaos in my personal life, the isolation sounded perfect. But by the end of the first night, I realized that peace wasn't what I'd find here. The snowstorm began just after I arrived. The flakes came thick and fast, erasing the road behind me and trapping me in a sea of white. By sunset, the world outside had disappeared into a blinding blur of snow. I felt strangely calm, watching the storm through the frosted window as I sipped coffee by the fire. It wasn't until I went to lock the door for the night that I saw them. Footprints, bare human footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest straight to my porch. They were small, too small to belong to an adult, and spaced unevenly, as if whoever made them had been stumbling. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't seen or heard anyone approach. There were no tracks leading away from the house, only those coming toward it. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting through my sweater. The snow absorbed the beam of light, casting a strange, muted glow over the scene. The footprints were fresh, crisp edges, not yet filled by falling snow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the wind. No answer. I followed the trail to the edge of the porch and shone the light into the trees. The beam caught nothing but an endless stretch of white. My breath clouded in front of me, and I realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. The wind had stopped. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. I took a step closer to the footprints, my boots crunching in the snow, and froze. There was another set of prints now, just a few feet away from the first. Larger, heavier. These ones weren't human. They were too wide, too long, with claw-like impressions at the tips. I stumbled backward onto the porch, slamming the door behind me. My heart raced as I bolted it shut and drew the curtains. The storm raged on through the night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, faint knocking on the windows, the creak of footsteps on the porch, and once, just once, a low guttural growl that made my skin crawl. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in silence. I hesitated before looking outside, half convinced I'd find more footprints, or worse. But the snow was pristine, undisturbed except for the trail I'd left the night before. I told myself I must have imagined it. The storm, the isolation, it could play tricks on the mind. That was until I found the door to the basement wide open. The basement of the cabin was little more than a root cellar, cold, damp, and cluttered with forgotten belongings. I rarely went down there, but that morning I felt drawn to it. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, the air growing colder with each step. My flashlight cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating shelves filled with rusted tools, jars of preserved food, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. At the far end of the room, something caught my eye. A wooden chest, partially buried under a tarp. I pulled the tarp away and opened the chest. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal with my grandfather's name etched on the cover. The photographs were strange, sepia-toned images of people standing in front of the cabin, their faces expressionless, and their eyes unnaturally dark. The journal was worse. The entries started innocently enough, describing the construction of the cabin and my grandfather's love for the solitude of the mountains. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. He wrote of hearing footsteps in the snow at night, of finding strange markings carved into the trees, and of seeing shadowy figures watching him from the edge of the forest. "They come in the storm," one entry read. "They walk where no man should walk, and they leave no trace behind. Do not follow their footprints." I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. That night, the footsteps returned. I woke to the sound of crunching snow, faint but deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. The footprints were back, winding their way around the house in a wide, looping arc. They were joined by the larger, clawed prints I'd seen before. I backed away from the window, my breath hitching as the footsteps grew louder. They weren't just outside anymore. They were on the porch. The doorknob rattled. My hands shook as I grabbed the fireplace poker and pressed myself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a whisper, a low, raspy voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You followed them." The door burst open, and the cold rushed in like a living thing. The last thing I saw before everything went black was a shadow, a tall, twisted figure silhouetted against the snow. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide. I woke up hours later, sprawled on the floor of the cabin. The door was closed, and the footprints were gone, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. I left the cabin that morning, leaving behind the journal, the photographs, and everything else. I didn't care about the storm or the blocked roads. I just needed to get away. But even now, weeks later, I still hear it. The footsteps. I had heard of Frosthaven before, but only in hushed whispers and half-forgotten folklore. It was a small village buried deep in the northern mountains, where winters stretched on endlessly and the sun barely rose above the horizon. Locals claimed it was cursed, but I never believed in such things. Not until I found myself stranded there. It started with a wrong turn. I was driving through the mountains, heading to a remote resort for a much-needed break. The storm hit suddenly, blinding and relentless, forcing me off the main road. My GPS was useless, so I followed the only road I could find, hoping it would lead to shelter. It did, but not the kind I wanted. Frosthaven was a ghost of a village, its narrow streets buried under layers of snow. The houses were old and crumbling, their windows dark and empty, like dead eyes staring out at nothing. The few people I saw moved quickly, heads down, bundled in heavy coats that seemed to swallow them whole. I parked near what looked like a tavern and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something metallic and sharp, like blood. The bartender, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks, glanced at me but said nothing. The few patrons at the tables didn't look up either. "Excuse me," I said, forcing a smile. "The storm forced me off the road. I just need directions back to the main highway." The bartender's gaze shifted to the window, where the snow whipped against the glass. "You won't find your way out tonight," he said in a low voice. "Stay here until morning." I rented a room above the tavern. It was small and cold, with a single bed and a warped window that looked out onto the village square. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't just the howling wind or the creaking of the old building. It was the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing things, soft footsteps in the hallway, faint whispers coming from the square. At one point, I got up and peeked out the window. That's when I saw her. A girl, standing barefoot in the snow. Her hair was long and matted, her dress thin and tattered, and her skin unnaturally pale. She was staring up at my window, her lips moving soundlessly. I stumbled back, my heart racing. When I looked again, she was gone. The next morning, I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and the snow had piled so high around the tires that it would take hours to dig it out. Frustrated, I returned to the tavern and asked the bartender for help. His response was strange. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his hands trembling as he poured me a cup of coffee. "They don't like outsiders." "Who?" I asked, but he wouldn't answer. I spent the day exploring the village, hoping to find someone who could help. Most of the houses were boarded up, their doors locked and windows shuttered. The few people I saw hurried away when I approached, their faces pale and drawn. The only person who spoke to me was an old woman sitting on a bench near the edge of the forest. Her eyes were cloudy with age, but her voice was sharp and clear. "You need to leave," she said, clutching a rosary in her gnarled hands. "Before the sun sets." "Why?" Her lips trembled. "Because when the cold comes, they come with it, the ones who don't belong." That night, I locked the door to my room and pushed a chair against it for good measure. I didn't want to risk another sleepless night staring out the window, so I drew the curtains tightly shut. But the whispers came anyway. They were louder this time, more insistent, like voices speaking just beyond the edge of hearing. And then there was a knock at the door. I froze, clutching the blanket to my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who is it?" I called, my voice trembling. Silence. I got up slowly, every instinct screaming at me to stay away from the door. But something compelled me to look. When I peeked through the peephole, I saw the girl from the square. She was standing in the hallway, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and black. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I stepped back, my breath hitching. The doorknob began to rattle violently, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping and blending into a cacophony of voices. Suddenly, the window shattered, and an icy wind swept through the room, knocking me to the floor. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, it was morning, and the room was empty. The door was still locked, and the window was intact, as if nothing had happened. But when I went downstairs, the tavern was empty. The fire was cold, the tables were covered in dust, and the bartender was nowhere to be found. I ran outside, desperate to find someone. Anyone. The village was eerily quiet, the streets empty. And then I saw the footprints. Dozens of them, leading from the forest to the tavern and back again. They weren't human. I didn't stop to think. I dug out my car as fast as I could and drove until the snow thinned and the sun finally broke through the clouds. I never found Frosthaven on a map, and when I asked locals about it, they only shook their heads. But sometimes, when the wind howls at night, I hear them, the whispers. And I know the village is still out there, waiting for the next traveler to lose their way. It was supposed to be a simple family trip, a quiet week in a secluded ski lodge to celebrate the holidays. My sister Mia and I were looking forward to it. We'd both been overworked, and the idea of crisp mountain air, warm fires, and endless snow seemed like the perfect escape. The lodge was deep in the Rockies, far from the noise of the city. It took hours to get there, the narrow roads winding through dense forests and steep cliffs. When we arrived, the lodge was exactly as the website had promised. Rustic but charming, with large wooden beams, a roaring fireplace in the lobby, and huge windows overlooking the snow-covered slopes. But something felt off. It started with the receptionist. She barely looked at us as we checked in, her fingers trembling as she handed us the room keys. "Enjoy your stay," she said flatly, her voice devoid of warmth. That night, as we unpacked in our room, Mia looked out the window and frowned. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing," she said quickly, pulling the curtains shut. It's too quiet out there." I laughed. "That's the point, isn't it? Peace and quiet?" But as the hours passed, I understood what she meant. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, almost alive, the kind of silence that made you strain to hear something, anything, to prove you weren't alone. The first night, I woke to the sound of soft tapping. At first, I thought it was snow or ice hitting the window, but when I looked, there was nothing there, just an endless expanse of white under a dark, moonless sky. The tapping continued, faint but deliberate, like fingers drumming against glass. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the next morning, Mia looked pale and exhausted. "Did you hear it?" she asked over breakfast. "The tapping?" I nodded, relieved I wasn't going crazy. "Yeah, it was probably just—" "Someone was outside my window," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "I saw them." I stared at her. "What do you mean? Who was it?" She shook her head. "I don't know. It was dark, but their face wasn't right. It was like they didn't have any features, just a blank, white face." I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "You're probably just tired. This place is messing with both of us." But deep down, I felt a growing unease. That day, we decided to explore the slopes. The lodge was nearly empty, with only a handful of other guests scattered across the property. The ski lift creaked and groaned as we ascended, the cold biting at our faces. At the top of the slope, we found an old abandoned cabin partially buried in snow. It was small, its windows broken, and its roof sagging under the weight of ice. "Let's check it out," Mia said, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The inside was worse than we expected. The walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. In the corner of the room, we found a pile of old photographs. They were black and white, showing groups of people standing outside the lodge. At first, they looked normal, smiling families, couples posing with their skis. But as we flipped through them, the faces began to change. The smiles disappeared, replaced by wide, empty eyes and gaping mouths, frozen in silent screams. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded, and we hurried back to the lodge, leaving the cabin and its horrifying contents behind. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. It wasn't just at the window. It was at the door, the walls, even the floor beneath the bed. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Mia was sitting on her bed, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. Before I could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing. Then, the door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint glow of the hallway. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. And its face was blank. I grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her toward the window. "We have to go," I hissed. We climbed out into the freezing night, the snow crunching beneath our boots as we ran. Behind us, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road. The lodge loomed behind us, dark and silent, its windows glowing faintly, as if something was watching us from within. A passing truck picked us up, the driver raising an eyebrow at our frantic appearance, but saying nothing. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The lodge stood still and empty, but in the distance I saw them, shadowy figures moving through the snow, their blank faces turned toward us. We never spoke of that trip again, but sometimes, when the world grows quiet and the wind howls outside my window, I hear it, the faint sound of tapping. And I wonder if they ever stopped following us,